competition event in Mexico City. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I ran the Irish Competition Authority, then the UK Competition Authority, the Office of Fair Trading, and chaired the International Competition Network. So reasonable sort of experience of looking at competition laws, both in detail in applying them and in international fora. And I'm going to say something about the economics and the role of the law, a few small comments on the law, and then I'm going to talk about how the UK system works in relation to market studies and market investigation references, because that's closest to the barrier to competition feature that's in Section 94, Article 94, and also earlier in the Act. And then I'll make a few comments about the Mexican law. But I'd like to start by just applauding the law. I mean, I think that there are too many countries in the world where competition law has been introduced that tackles mergers and does a little bit on cartels, but does very little to tackle the close links between politicians and big business, where you have rich monopolists that basically dictate the terms in which they do business. This is why the antitrust laws were set up in the United States in the 1890s. There's a very nice book by the former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato on antitrust and democracy. It's why a big part of why the Treaty of Rome has such strong competition features was to discipline the links between big business and the market. And so strong competition policy isn't just good for consumers, for productivity growth. It's good for the poorest consumers who typically bear a disproportionate burden of high prices, but it also supports democracy and supports anti-corruption. So I think Mexico is really to be applauded because it's one of the leading countries of the industrializing countries in terms of implementing competition policy. And that's, I think, the reason why I came here today, because I respect that a lot. Now, I'm not going to talk about many other features of the law. I'm going to say a few things in passing that others have said better than I can say. It would be better to focus on monopolization than the existence of monopoly. That's what the EU and US law focus on. Monopoly itself is a difficult thing to focus on. Many features may be best left for the Commission to decide. I think some of the things in Article 56 on defining very precisely margin squeeze and predatory pricing are too specific. The case law should be allowed to develop. And similarly, some limits might be put on the essential facility argument. Two other personal remarks. There's no provision in the law that I could see on minority shareholdings. The EU has now recognized that as a gap. A company can take a minority shareholding in a rival, prevent anybody else from buying it, and that can be restrictive of competition, and most laws don't capture it. The UK, German laws do, and the EU is about to introduce a provision to do that. And I think that the restrictions on termination of people who work in the agency, what they do afterwards, those are too strict. I think if you have a good commissioner who works for 5 years and would stay on for another 5, it's not obvious that you want to restrict where they can work afterwards. And I think that could restrict how long people stay in office. So those are just some small remarks on reading the law and some features of the law that struck me. So I'm now going to focus specifically on the markets regime. And the UK unusually has this system where even if nobody's broken the law, so no cartel, no monopoly, no other illegal behavior, the market can be examined and the market can have new rules put in place, new regulation, or companies can be broken up. And it looks at both consumer and competition aspects. It has two phases. It was until last week 2 separate bodies. The UFT did phase 1, so it opens up the issue, asks the question, is there a problem? And if it concludes that there is a serious problem in the market, it can refer to a second body that was called the Competition Commission. And that was phase 2, a different set of decision makers who approached the issue de novo. So the first phase, the Office of Fair Trading can do market studies. These are not unlike the market studies the Commission here can do. They look at a variety of things, including regulation, market behavior, consumer contracts. In fact, we've looked at both markets and cross-market themes. So private healthcare, the audit profession, motor insurance, cement, payday lending. They're currently just on energy, and they're looking at SME lending, small and medium-sized enterprise lending to banks. But we've also looked at themes. We've looked at commercial use of public information, how public sector bodies don't enable private bodies to use the information they have. We've looked at consumer contracts. We've looked at how consumer information is harvested to make targeted price offers to consumers across markets. So we've looked at thematic things, and we've looked at consumer issues, pure consumer issues. So for example, in the financial crisis, companies were offering sale and rent back. They'd buy your house and rent it back to you and then take it from you quite quickly. And that was a consumer protection issue. So we looked at issues like that. There are a number of outcomes. The OFT at phase 1 could give a clean bill of health, say we think this market's broadly okay. It could make recommendations to the industry for voluntary improvements, and we separately ran a code service where we could help an industry put a code of conduct, a voluntary code in place for compliance around certain things. So for example, the travel agent industry had a voluntary code on compensating people if there was a bankruptcy or if something went under. They put money together and they had a compensation arrangement. We oversaw that code. They can make recommendations to government. And there's an important feature in the UK. It works okay. The government has an obligation, a legal obligation, to give a response in 3 months as to what it's going to do about the OFT recommendation. And it's required as a public response. Now, in fact, they don't do it terribly well. It could be stronger. In Italy, there's an even stronger provision that Parliament must have a debate on the annual recommendations of the autorità in Italy. And I think anything you can do to make Parliament and the legislature and the government pay more attention to regulatory restrictions on competition, because I think in countries like Mexico, even still in the UK, but UK's dismantled many state restrictions. We've had many successful privatizations. But in countries like Mexico, it's really important that the government removes local and national restrictions on competition, barriers to entry in particular. And if the Competition Commission in studies is making recommendations but they're falling on deaf ears, you need to strengthen that mechanism. The final thing that the OFT can do at phase 1 is it can make a recommendation to the Competition Commission to do a market investigation reference called an MIR, or market investigation. And this is a big deal, because once you go there, that's it. The review is a judicial review just on process. So if you get broken up or you have restrictions put on your behavior afterwards, you really don't have much recourse. There have been 5 so far appeals, judicial review of the decisions of the Competition Commission. And although 4 of those have been successful on technical points of law, the matter has been sent back to the Competition Commission, which has restored its previous decision. So no appeal has been successful. So once the Commission makes a decision at phase 2, it is basically final. And I have 2 clients at the moment. One is appealing, the other is thinking of appealing. And they know that the probability is low that they will succeed. So the CC can only look at things that are referred to it. It's a reference body. And because it's a reference body, it has important constitutional implications. And this is why, first, it only has judicial review. Because it is not asked to look at the issue, it is looking at it with a fresh mind. Secondly, it can legislate. It can put in place secondary legislation. So it can require the companies to do things by order. And that is a delegated power from Parliament, reflecting the fact that it is almost like an independent royal commission. And it also has immense powers, and including the power of divestiture. And again, I would just emphasize, even where nobody has broken the law, in fact, if somebody has broken the law, that takes primacy. And I'll come back to that decision. If there is a separate legal infringement, should you use this barrier to competition provision? The legal test is very simple. It refers to any feature of the market that has an adverse effect on competition. So the legal test is very broad, like the barrier to competition test here. But there are some restrictions on it. So let me talk a little bit about how it's been used. And it's been used in, I would say, 4 types of situation so far. The first type of situation is where there are issues around consumer pricing or switching costs. Northern Irish banks, home collected credit. These are people who go around to the doorstep and give credit to people and then come and collect it the next day, usually aimed at poor people, elderly people, disabled people and so forth who are tied to the home. Store cards, cards that, like credit cards, that are given to you by retailers. And the biggest one of all was payment protection insurance. When you take out a loan, a bank loan or a car loan or some other product, the bank would offer you insurance in the event that you were unable to. It's not bad, it's not good, it satisfies a lot of people. And if it's done well, it can make an improvement. The second area is tacit collusion. 2 cases have been sent over where there was a suspicion of tacit collusion. In one case, we had seen many, many small bus mergers, big companies buying up local bus companies. Each one of them got approved, but we were highly suspicious that the companies were segmenting the market, because when a local bus came up for sale, only one bidder, almost always. And there were strong regional presences. So it looked like the companies had decided to carve up the market regionally, but there was no agreement, no evidence of collusion. The Competition Commission didn't find any evidence of that, almost a clean bill of health. Then we sent over the cement market. In almost every country in Europe that has more than one cement company, there are investigations into cartels in cement, but we'd never had a cartel in cement in the UK, or at least not in the last 15 years. So we came under a lot of pressure politically from our own board, whether we really looked at the cement market thoroughly enough. So we did a market study. We were concerned about information sharing and other practices. We sent it over. The Competition Commission has decided in January of this year to require the largest company, which is a market share of 36%, to divest 1/4 of its assets, i.e. to go down to 27%, because of a theory of tacit collusion. And the theory of tacit collusion is essentially that in the recession, all the market shares stayed very stable when demand went down. There's a lot more evidence in the report, but basically that's what it boils down to. It's a not particularly sophisticated theory. There's a lot of bad information sharing. They're separately clearing that up. I think that's not an argument that anybody has taken up with the Commission. That case is now on appeal by Lafarge Tarmac, the company in question. But that's an example of an oligopoly breakup with tacit collusion. Those are the only 2 tacit collusion cases, but tacit collusion was always one of the cases we were interested in testing the law with. The third type of case that has been sent over, so I've dealt with consumer issues and tacit collusion, is unilateral or single-player market power. And the first of these was the breakup of the British Airports Authority. It owned Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted Airport in London, the 3 of the 4 big airports in London, actually the 3 biggest airports in London. So a market share of over 90%, a revenue share way higher because Heathrow is very valuable. They separately owned multiple airports close to each other in Scotland. It was an issue when I arrived at the OFT that I personally took an interest in because I'd been responsible for breaking up the airports in Ireland, but by legislation, because Ireland, like America, doesn't have this feature, so I persuaded the Transport Minister to do it as head of the Competition Authority. In Britain, I thought, well, let's test the law on this. We investigated it, we sent it over. In 2008, the Commission recommended breakup. By 2012, all of the appeal routes had been exhausted and the disposals happened. And now we have a really interesting situation. That was a market where the doubt that was expressed was big barriers to entry in airports. How can more rivalry, when you have no new capacity, make a difference? Gatwick, even in a short period of time, Gatwick has reported way better customer service, much more competition for airlines between different airports because there is some spare capacity. But most importantly, the government has a commission looking at airport capacity expansion. And these airports have been ferocious competitors in bidding for new capacity. That would never have happened with a single airport. So I think this is a huge long-term benefit for the economy. It could not have been done by applying abusive dominance provisions. The airport had not abused its dominant position, but it had a 90% market share. The CCs looked at unilateral market power in at least 2 other cases. Tesco, the largest supermarket, with about 30% of the market, had high market share, above 50-60% in some local markets. About 10 local markets, its market share was very, very high. If you went out in the street, every supermarket, almost all of them were Tesco. And the Commission decided not to do anything about that. It was a number of local markets, and they felt that the market was dynamic. But then, in private hospitals, a decision published last Wednesday, the 3rd of April, the Commission decided that Hospital Corporation of America, or HCA for short, It is not the biggest. I think it's the third biggest private hospital group in the UK, but it's the biggest in London. And they defined a narrow-ish market in central London, and they said they had over 50% of revenue and over 40% of hospitals, and they have required them to divest 25% of their hospitals in central London. These hospitals were acquired legitimately. There was merger approval given for some of them. They've been in possession of the company for 8-12 years. The company's argument is that it's a high-quality service, and they have built up a successful franchise, and they've done that by being a more efficient and more successful business. They have done nothing illegal, and they think this is very unjust. And so they've said they're appealing the decision. But that's an example of a company that is not a monopoly being broken up, and it's not even a national monopoly. It's not even the biggest player in the country. Finally, the fourth category is a number of these cases have examined buyer power. And this is a contentious issue in the retail sector. And in the grocery sector, the Tesco sector, there, the Competition Commission explored an interesting theory of harm, that supermarkets would encourage food processors to invest in specific facilities, a new plant just to produce for my supermarket. And the new plant would be a sunk specific investment. It would, all its packaging would be based around my product, my shelving, and whatever else. And then 2 years into a 5-year contract, they would turn around to this processor and say, actually, we want to reduce the prices by 10%, knowing that the processor had no choice where to go, and they had made this specific investment. And they call this an investment hold-up problem. Now, in the report, they found no evidence that this had actually happened, but prophylactically, they decided they wanted to regulate for it, and they recommended an ombudsman. I opposed that. And they were not very happy with their sister competition body opposing it. It took a long time, change of government before it got implemented. The farmers tried to have it as a general charter to raise prices for farmers. It has been implemented. It probably won't make a big difference. It's just a regulatory burden on the sector. But it was an interesting example of where I think the Commission leaned over too much politically to be nice to small players. And if I see two risks, one of them is being nice to big players because you don't tackle them properly, and the other is being nice to small players because they're politically powerful. In fact, most of the problem that competition policy has is small players and big players. Small players are too politically powerful locally, and big players are too politically powerful centrally. So you have Carlos Slim on the one hand, and then you have local farmers on the other hand, and you have to try and deal with both of these at the same time. So let me try and conclude with some lessons. Sorry, I've gone on a little long, but it's, I think, useful to see how this tool has been applied. I think in some cases, like payment protection insurance and BAA, it's been seen as a good thing, unambiguously, a good thing to have had this power. But I also think that there are some situations where I would be critical of it. I don't think the Competition Commission has often enough found a clean bill of health. I think this instrument could be more useful if, and this is what America, the Federal Trade Commission, has looked at petrol prices and other things and said there's not a problem. And I think if the Competition Commission more often said, like with buyer power in supermarkets, actually there's not a problem. This could be a useful instrument to make the public feel, because if you have pent-up public pressure, we want this issue investigated. Actually having an independent body that is sometimes being very tough on business, saying, in this case we don't think so, that's a useful thing. We haven't done that enough. Secondly, I'm not sure what I think about breaking up oligopolies. I think breaking up monopolies is a good thing to do, especially if they are state-created, state-protected, state-funded. And I think this feature of the law could be good for doing that, but not for necessarily going after oligopolies. Third thing I would be critical of is the Competition Commission, the shorter the time you have, the more you will rely on third parties. And if third parties are providing evidence, they will have vested interests on the outcome. And one of the things you see is if there's divestments, the competitors who want to get those divested assets will all say things that are not necessarily in the public interest. And the Commission won't have an independent evidence base. And that's a risk with short timescales. And I think there has been too little focus on government restrictions on competition, and there's been too little economics. You need to have very good economists running this process. And the Competition Commission has not had, in my view, strong enough economic input to evaluate the economic arguments. So, on your law, I'm hesitant to say anything about what Mexico should do. That's a subject for Mexican citizens and Mexican Parliament. But some advice. The legal test is perhaps a little unclear, but the Commission can do a lot to clarify it by judicious intervention. And so if the Parliament cannot clarify it, I think it's very important that in its early acts the Commission seeks to clarify how it's going to enforce the law. I think the instrument might be useful, but I think it should be confined. And if the law is to be amended, you could put some restrictive conditions. First, that it is used to deal primarily with structural monopoly or structural barriers to entry created by the government, where they're either government, former privatized companies, they've been government protected, government licensed, or government funded or government subsidized. If that is present, I think that's a good criterion. And if that's not in the law, it'd be a very good thing for the Commission to say in its prioritization.